I'm very glad to be joined by Luisa Neubauer, who's a German environmental activist and one of the main organizers of the German Fridays for the Future school strike for climate action. Luisa, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I want to start with the devastating floods that we've seen in Germany this summer. And I understand that you went out there to see these floods, perhaps to help with the relief efforts a bit. What did you see? What did the aftermath of the floods look like, and how are recovery efforts going?
It's been an incredibly odd situation. We are assumed to be one of those places on Earth where you're kind of safe from the climate crisis. And that's a very privileged and, of course, paradox perspective, but that's how the climate crisis has been handled. And so with Fridays for Future, for the past 2.5 years, we've been going out on the streets and saying, hey, the climate crisis is here. Yeah. It's happening around the world. It's happening at the most affected places the most. Yet it's also happening here. And still, being one of those people who've been saying this every single day, it's been shocking. It's been unbelievable, that the devastation, I couldn't have imagined that. And it's... people talk a lot about this kind of German welfare and how people worked hard for decades to kind of build their homes and buy their cars. And within just hours, everything what they've kind of tried to achieve, everything they've worked for in the past was just kind of, flooding, running down the streets. And that is infrastructure that has lasted for decades, that has, experienced wars in the past. And then we just saw it all collapsing in the midst of the climate crisis. That's been a very odd and shocking and sad experience.
One of the things I've noticed here in the United States is that we have extreme weather events a lot, floods, fires. And sometimes people don't immediately connect them to climate change, although that's beginning to change. Did you get a sense in Germany that people immediately were drawing a connection between the climate crisis and the floods?
Yeah, that's been an interesting spin there, because this devastation just happened in one particular area in the country, in the beginning at least. So in most other places, for quite some days, people didn't really recognize how heavy that damage really was. So it was kind of, from the distance, was kind of easy to say, oh, that's a climate crisis. It's happening. And immediately after those floods hit those regions, people started talking about the climate crisis and how it's, unraveling in Germany. And it was just, it wasn't until a few days later that as people came up and say, oh, no, you shouldn't talk about the climate here because, you need to make sure that people understand it's all about them and it's all about the floods. But then it was already too late in a sense, because the discourse had already started and there wasn't a single point in those floods where people kind of deny this being connected to the climate crisis. And it was always been considered as a consequence of the escalating climate crisis. And so, yes, as you're saying, we are seeing people, especially in those regions, kind of really standing up and saying, hey, this is a climate crisis happening here and now, and we are obviously not protected. So I do think it has changed the perspective on our vulnerability.
Vulnerability, yeah.
Yes, yeah. That's a word. Yeah, it's the government kind of it kind of acted like we were immune to the climate crisis. And everything you would do to protect us from this would just be, this kind of nice charity action, but not really necessary. And suddenly, it turns out we are being hurt and we are being hit and we are not at all protected or immune.
What do you think of the government's response to date? I mean, obviously, you've pushed for more climate action. There's also the question of just preparing for the effects of climate change. So that in addition to taking steps to deal with the climate crisis, part of what this seemed to reveal is that all societies need to be taking greater steps to protect people from the way in which the weather is going to change. How do you look at the current German government's response?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think one thing that really struck out is that there wasn't a alarm system in place. And that is, we're speaking of an area in Germany which is known to be a high-risk area. because the soil is really dense. So when rain hits, it kind of, doesn't sink in, it just kind of floods down the hills. People knew, and scientists knew, and governments even knew, local governments knew that this is a high risk area. Yet there was no adequate system to protect and to warn people. So what does it mean? It kind of, it really highlights how little even our governments believe in the realness of the climate crisis. There are these reports around, and they say technically, this is a high risk area, but deep down you're kind of like, you're not really believing it. So I would think that, the devastation happening is also a consequence of this kind of deep down denial of climate crisis happening in this country. Not on paper, not in speeches, but in action. When politicians travel to the region, and they would, stand in all these flooded streets, and in the streets that used to be streets, it was an odd situation for them, because they knew they very much messed up, and they are responsible of not having warned people, not having installed the systems, while at the same time wanting to prove that they did nothing wrong. And that's obviously an impossible task. So we saw a lot of what I would kind of describe as political theater. So people changing their minds all the time, saying, oh, that's bad, we need to do something about the climate crisis, and then next day coming up and saying, no, it's just one event, you can't just change politics because of one event. Eventually, I guess it kind of highlighted how little government, I would say, in the larger sense, and politics is prepared to face those catastrophes. And it turned out that our government wasn't really capable of reacting adequately.
And obviously, there's an election coming up in Germany. Climate has been one of many issues in that election. It's the first election that's going to produce a chancellor other than Angela Merkel in a long time. You've had Greens on the rise in German politics. What do you think the impact, if any, of the flood is going to be on the election, and how is climate factoring into the politics leading into the election?
I mean, many people are asking me whether that's a climate election, and I would on that say that indeed every election happening everywhere really is a climate election, just because any kind of consequence from this election very much shapes our chances to do anything about the climate crisis. And we are one of the richest countries on earth. We are one of the heavy emitters. We are one of the most responsible places. So this is not a feel-good election. This is not just about, who's representing us in other countries, but this is really about what such privileged place does about its role in the climate crisis. Then there is a second dimension to this. This is this whole election campaign, this process running up to the elections right now. It is effectively about climate. It's the most controversial issue. It's the one that's being most talked about. It's the one that produces the most headlines. It's really the number one issue that people care about, that voters care about. People are really looking at it. Then, of course, we're seeing how political parties are trying to find a balance between pleasing voters by kind of not saying how heavily governments have messed up in the past, while at the same time producing answers that are, real and living up to the challenge. And that's a complicated issue. And I mean, for people outside Germany, I mean, it's probably most people don't know about this, but it's a very interesting political landscape here, just because we have so many parties who have very good chances of, being part of the future government. So we're speaking of 5 different parties, and one that's, the far right that people don't consider to be, governing. But of those 5 democratic parties, all of them are considered to be at least, likely to get into the next government. And that's a big deal. It means we have to kind of, expect everything and anything.
What would you like to see the German government's policy be on climate? I mean, obviously there's the question of what Germany itself does, and then there's the question of Germany's leadership in the European Union, which obviously is going to be very important to global action. But what do you want to see, and how far apart are the political parties from the kinds of actions you'd like to see?
In the past year, every single major party has kind of committed to fight for 1.5, fight 1.5 politics.
Yeah.
And that's big. And I trying to be humble here, but I think Fridays for Future has done a job there at least. So that's one thing we can at least look at.
And just so people know, that's, you guys have advocated 1.5 degrees Celsius warming as the goal, not 2 degrees. Yeah.
Yes, and we have made this we started this global campaign called Fight for 1.5, and it's really led to all of those parties claiming, yes, of course, we want to work for that. We're seeing that all of them say they want to fight for 1.5 and at the same time not providing the plans we would need. So that, of course, already sheds a light on what we are facing in the next legislation, a lot of work coming up, I guess. What, of course, we would need is our government not just to provide a plan for our national emission budget, about how we stick to planetary boundaries within, German territory, but to also kind of take a lead in European politics, or at least inspire European politics in a way that we would need it to. And there actually the Biden administration, I guess, has helped a bit. There is a lot to criticize there, yet I think what the Biden administration has shown is what it looks like when you take a lead in climate. And so everyone is now turning at the German government and saying, hey, so we have quite a strong government, or we had quite a strong government. For 16 years, we had Chancellor Merkel. Where was the point that she would kind of, rise up and say, look, hello, this is a challenge and we're willing to tackle it. And, if you want to stop me, go ahead. But, you won't get me down on this. And this has never happened before. Rather the opposite. In European politics, the German government was often one of those governments who secretly, blocked environmental legislation and environmental policy when it, came down to concrete measures in order to protect our car industry or coal industry or so on.
Just talking about Fridays for the Future, you guys have obviously had a huge impact in German politics and European politics to reach the United States. We see also, of course, now, to deal with climate change, one of the biggest challenges in the world is going to be in Brazil and protecting the Amazon. They have an election upcoming. You guys have been pretty amazing at a remarkably young age in galvanizing kind of global mobilization. What are you guys doing to kind of make sure that the kind of effective pressure you're bringing to bear in places like Germany, that kind of pressure and that kind of mobilization is taking place in other countries?
Luckily enough, we are a global movement, so there's always Fridays for Future in Brazil, there's Fridays for Future in, many places around the world, even in China, there's activism happening. In places like India, we are regularly surprised by the power of those movements rising on the streets. And I remember that day that, I got a text message of someone saying, hey, did you know that there were 30,000 school children in Ethiopia striking for the climate right now? And we didn't even know that they were preparing those strikes, but that's happening. Our pressure is happening around the world. And then, of course, what we try to do also is to kind of put pressure on transboundary issues. So, for instance, there is this this trade agreement between the EU and Southern American countries happening right now. So that's called the Mercosur agreement. And we know that this agreement, for instance, in the worst case, would trigger much more of, rainforest burning and land use changes. So what we're trying to do here is we're talking to European leaders saying you need to get out of this agreement in solidarity with our Brazilian and Southern American activists who know that this trade agreement will work against, biodiversity and climate protection right there. Making sure that we increase pressure from the outside and the inside as we see that this regularly helps a lot. And sometimes, eventually, it's surprisingly banal, but it makes such a difference if people feel like they're under a international spotlight. If people know that they're being seen, if people, and governments know that they are being watched with whatever they do, not just from the activists they're speaking to all the time or they're hearing from all the time, but from places around the world and media around the world.
What should people do, who are watching this, who obviously would like to see greater action on the climate crisis, but they don't quite know how to participate, they don't quite know how to get involved? Like, what would you tell people to do who care about this?
Organize. Get together. I think, eventually we know that those changes necessary are possible as soon as we, start taking ourselves seriously in this. Nothing is for granted. Nothing is just going to happen, except maybe more, climate crisis. Any positive changes we need to see in the world, and we want to see in the world, start with people getting together around this. Start with people understanding that they are wanted in this. There is a tendency to consider other countries to be at the forefront. So I guess many people from, international spaces think that Germany does a very good job in, protecting the climate and inventing new technologies and in doing all those things you're supposed to do. And I'm so sorry to tell everyone, but this is not true. We are not sticking to what we promised. In fact, we're kind of betraying the international community here, because we're going out advocating to be this climate champion and at the same time making sure that our coal really destroys our climate performance everywhere. That there's no point on relying on others to figure this out. We all need to act up in the places where we are, knowing that, we're everywhere and the environmental community, the climate movement is growing, and in places around the world, in every kind of corner, people are getting organized. And eventually this all can work out when we get more and more and more, and we understand that we are needed wherever we are. And, this is basically, this is allowing others to get going wherever they are.
It's been great talking to you. That's a very motivating way to conclude. I mean, I think you guys have given a lot of people a sense of at least agency, right, of the capacity to do something about this. So hopefully that pressure continues to build, and hopefully that contributes to a better German policy in the near term too. So thanks so much, Luisa, for everything you're doing.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.